Imagine standing in a forest at night, surrounded by others like you, landless, angry, and ready to fight. You raise your right hand, swear a sacred oath, and promise never to betray your brothers or your cause. This was the beginning of the Mau Mau Uprising, one of the most powerful and misunderstood revolts against colonial rule in African history. The story of the Mau Mau isn't just about rebellion, it's about land, identity, and the desperate struggle of a people pushed to the edge. When the British colonized Kenya in the late 1800s, they took control of the most fertile lands, especially in the Central Highlands, and gave them to European settlers. These lands were the ancestral home of the Kikuyu people. Thousands were pushed out and forced to live in overcrowded reserves, often without enough food, freedom, or opportunity. Many were turned into cheap laborers on their own land. By the 1940s, frustration had reached a boiling point. World War II had ended, and African soldiers who had fought alongside the British returned home, hoping for change only to find the same poverty, oppression, and racial discrimination waiting for them. Peaceful political movements like the Kenya African Union tried to push for reform, but their efforts were ignored or crushed. So, something darker began to stir in the shadows. Young Kikuyu men and women started taking secret oaths, binding themselves to the cause of land and freedom. These were not just symbolic promises, they were deadly serious. The Mau Mau, as they came to be called, were ready to fight. In October 1952, violence erupted. The British colonial government declared a state of emergency. The Mau Mau began attacking farms, infrastructure, and especially African loyalists seen as traitors. The British responded with overwhelming force, sending in troops, building detention camps, and carrying out mass arrests. Operation Anvil, launched in 1954, completely locked down Nairobi. British soldiers rounded up tens of thousands of Kikuyu civilians, many innocent, and sent them to detention centers. At its peak, over 1 million people were forcibly relocated into heavily guarded villages surrounded by barbed wire. The goal? Starve the Mau Mau of their civilian support. Inside the forests, Mau Mau fighters, armed with little more than spears, homemade guns, and raw courage, waged a brutal guerrilla war, but the cost was enormous. By 1956, British forces had captured the most prominent Mau Mau leader, Dedan Kimathi, a former schoolteacher turned revolutionary. He was hanged in 1957. His capture marked the symbolic end of the uprising. But let's be clear, both sides committed horrors. Mau Mau fighters were responsible for dozens of brutal killings, most infamously the Lari massacre of 1953, where over 70 loyalist Kikuyu were killed, including women and children. The British, in turn, built a network of detention camps, often compared to concentration camps, where prisoners were beaten, tortured, and sometimes killed. One woman who fought with the Mau Mau, Muthoni wa Kirima, became a rare female field marshal. She not only carried weapons but also treated wounded fighters deep in the forests. Her story, like many others, was buried for decades but is now being told. In the end, over 11,000 Mau Mau were killed, though the real number may be much higher. Tens of thousands were imprisoned or detained without trial. British settlers lost fewer than 100 lives, yet the uprising left a deep mark. Though the British eventually crushed the Mau Mau militarily, they could not crush the spirit behind the movement. The world was watching, and the brutality of colonial rule was being exposed. International pressure mounted. By 1960, the state of emergency was lifted. By 1963, Kenya gained its independence, and who became the country's first prime minister? Jomo Kenyatta, a man once falsely accused of leading the Mau Mau and imprisoned for nearly a decade. Today, the Mau Mau are no longer called terrorists. In 2003, they were officially recognized as freedom fighters by the Kenyan government. In 2013, the British government offered a formal apology and paid compensation to some of the victims of torture. But for many families, the scars remain. The Mau Mau Uprising was not just a war, it was a cry for dignity, a cry for home, a cry that still echoes in Kenya's forests and in its soul. This was the story of a people who chose resistance over silence, and though many of their names are lost to history, their fight lives on.